The flashlight beam caught the hoof line first, then the place where it stopped, and Dale Ferris stood in the wet cut of the gravel lane at 4 a.m. and could not make the two facts agree. The doe had been walking. He could read that much. 5 clean prints in the soft shoulder mud, the gait even, the toes splayed the way a deer splays them when it is not yet running. Then nothing. No drag, no scuff, no blood, no place where the animal had bunched and leapt. The track simply ended in the middle of open ground, as if the doe had been lifted straight up off the road, and Dale crouched there, with the cold coming up through his knees, and felt the first thing he had felt in years that he could not name and could not explain away. He had walked this lane in the dark his whole life. The hollow ran down off the ridge in a long, crooked seam. Brushy fork at the bottom of it carrying snowmelt and creek rock and the occasional dead limb, and the lane followed the water the way every old road in that part of Tennessee followed the water, because the water had been there first and knew the easiest way down. Dale kept the gate at the top of the lane, and the culverts under it, and the low water crossing where the fork ran over the road in March. And he kept the 40 acres of pasture and standing timber his father had kept before him. He was a man who fixed things. He stayed ahead of weather and chance and rust. He did not panic on ice, did not cut blind corners, did not invent stories to make a quiet life feel larger than it was. He was 61, and he had the body of a man who had used it every day of those years. His hands had gone thick and stiff in the knuckles from cold mornings and barbed wire and the slow grind of work, and the right one carried a white seam across the back, where a chainsaw had kicked into him at 40 and he had driven himself one-handed down to the clinic and watched a doctor half his age sew it shut. He read weather in his joints before the radio gave it to him. He kept a carpenter pencil behind his ear, and a folding rule in his hip pocket, and a roll of mechanic's wire under the truck seat, because a man who could measure a thing and bind a thing could fix most of what a farm threw at him. He measured before he cut. He cut before he doubted. That was the order, and the order had carried him 61 years. And standing in the lane with the dead deer track in front of him, he reached, without thinking, for the rule in his pocket, because measuring was what he did when the world stopped making sense, and the reaching was the first sign that the world had. So he looked at the place where the prints ended, and he did the thing he always did. He made it ordinary. The doe spooked and bounded, and the leap cleared the soft shoulder and landed on the hard pack where it left no print. That was reasonable. He ran the flashlight out along the hard pack, for 30 feet in both directions. Slow. The way he would check a fence line for the one staple that had let go. He found the gravel undisturbed. He found a beer can flattened by a tire 2 summers back. He found the green glint of a possum's eyes down by the culvert and watched them blink out as it moved off. He did not find where the doe had come down. A deer that clears 15 feet still has to land, and a thing that lands leaves a mark, and there was no mark. And Dale stood up slower than a man his age should have to, and turned the light off and let the dark settle back over the lane. It was the dark he noticed next, or rather the sound inside it, which was none. April in the hollow was loud at 4 a.m. Spring peepers down at the fork, a screech owl most nights up in the dead chestnut, the creek itself running its low, constant talk over the rocks. Dale had heard that sound so many mornings, he had stopped hearing it the way a man stops hearing the refrigerator until it quits. It had quit. The peepers were not calling. The owl was not working the field edge. The creek ran on because water does not care, but everything that had a voice and a choice had gone silent, and the silence had a shape to it, a held quality, the quality of a room where someone has stopped talking because someone else has walked in. He told himself it was the cold snap, A late frost would shut the peepers down. That was true, and he knew it was true, and he stood in the truth of it, and was not comforted, because the peepers had been calling when he walked out of the house 20 minutes ago. And a frost does not fall in 20 minutes, and the screech owl did not answer to frost. He clicked the light back on. Nothing moved. He swung it once across the tree line where the pasture met the timber, and the bean died in the wet black trunks and gave him nothing back. And he became aware standing there that he had come out to find a missing heifer, and had not thought about the heifer in 10 minutes. The heifer was why he was up. His wife Renata had heard it bawling around 3, a high panic note that did not stop, and she had put her hand on his shoulder in the dark and said the word she always said, which was just his name, and he had pulled his boots on over bare feet and gone out. By the time he reached the lower gate, the bawling had cut off mid-cry. He had assumed she got herself untangled from the brush along the fork, or worked back under the wire where she had pushed through cattle. Did that. They got somewhere they shouldn't, and made a racket and then quit, because the racket changed nothing. He had not assumed anything else, because there had never been anything else to assume. Now he stood in the dead quiet lane with a deer track that ended in the air, and he walked down toward the fork to find his heifer, and he kept the flashlight low and steady. And he did not hurry, because hurrying in the dark was how you broke an ankle, and a broken ankle a mile from the house was how a careful man died of his own carelessness. Pattern kept you alive. He had told his sons that when they were small, and his father had told it to him, and he repeated those facts to himself now, like bolts in a checklist, as the timber closed in over the lane and the temperature dropped, the way it always dropped near running water. He found her at the second bend, where the lanes swung in close to the fork, and a stand of river cane grew thick on the bank. The flashlight found her shape, and his mind made it a downed cow before his eyes had finished the work, and he stopped 12 feet off and stood very still. She was on her side in the cane. She was not moving. He did not go closer for a moment because some part of him older than thought had stopped him. The same part that pulls a hand back from a stove before the heat registers. And he stood there and made himself breathe, and made himself look. She had not been torn. That was the first thing, and it should have been a mercy, and was not. There was no opened belly, no scattered mess of the kind a pack of dogs leaves, no sign of feeding at all. She lay on her side with her legs out straight and her neck wrong, turned too far, the head nearly under the shoulder, and her eyes were open and already gone flat in the beam. Dale had put down stock before. He had pulled a calf that died in the night, and he had shot a horse with a broken cannon bone, and he knew what dead cattle looked like and how they got that way. He did not know how a 600-pound heifer got her neck turned like a wrung chicken in the time it took a man to walk a half-mile of lane. He crouched again. The careful man came back into him, and he made himself catalog it the way he would catalog storm damage for the insurance flat, in order, no adjectives, because adjectives were how you lied to yourself. The ground around her was torn up, but only on her side. The cane flattened in a fan, the mud churned. He looked for tracks in the churn, and the light gave him one clear impression at the edge of the flattened cane, where the mud was smooth, and he held the beam on it, and went still a second time. It was not a paw, and it was not a hoof. It was longer than his own boot by a third, narrow at the heel and spread at the front into what he first counted as 4, and then, holding the light steady, counted as 5. The 5th set off and lower like a thumb that had pressed in after the rest. The toes ended in points that had gone deeper than the pads, deep enough to throw little crescents of mud forward. He put his own hand down in the air above it, not touching, and his spread fingers did not reach across it. He stayed there a long moment with the creek running and the cold in his knees, and he did not name the thing that would have made the print, because there was no name in him for it, and because naming it would have made it real in a way he was not ready to make it. He stood, and he turned the light off, and he listened, and the silence was still holding. And into the silence came a sound he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who had not heard it. It came from across the fork, from the black timber on the far bank, and it was low, a bass rumble he felt in his sternum before he heard it in his ears. And under the rumble or inside it ran a second sound, a faster chattering vibration, so that the whole of it seemed to come from two throats working in one chest. It was not a coyote. He knew coyotes the way he knew his own cattle. It was not a bear, and the county had no wolves, and it was not anything that belonged to the list of things that lived in the hollow. And it was close enough that the careful man in him understood, with a cold and total clarity, that he had walked down here in the dark and stood over fresh kill, and that he was not, in this moment, the thing doing the hunting. He walked back up the lane. He did not run. Running told the dark you were prey, and some animal certainty in him knew the difference between walking away and fleeing. And he walked with a dead light in his hand and his heart going hard and even. And behind him, on the far bank, the sound did not follow and did not repeat, and the not repeating was worse than another call would have been, because it meant the thing was satisfied to watch him leave and felt no need to say anything more about it. Renata was up when he came in, a robe over her nightgown and the kitchen light on, and the coffee already going, and she looked at his face and did not ask the easy question. She asked what it was, and he stood in the doorway, with the mud drying on his boots, and told her the heifer was dead, and that he did not know how, and that he would deal with it at first light. She watched him say it. They had been married 31 years, and she had learned the whole grammar of the things he did not say. And she heard the size of the space around his words, and she did not fill it with comfort. She poured him coffee. She set it on the table where he sat. She said they would call the county in the morning, and he said yes, and neither of them slept again. She had grown up 2 ridges over, and she was not a soft woman. She had buried a daughter at 11 months back when the boys were small, a thing the 2 of them carried between them and almost never set down in words. And after that there was not much the world could do to her that would make her flinch in front of a man. She sat across from him in the lamplight with her own cup gone cold, and she watched him turn the feed receipt over in his fingers, the one with the 11 inches written on the back. And she did not ask to see it. She asked him one thing more. She asked if he had been afraid. He thought about lying to her and did not, because 31 years had also taught him that she could hear a lie land the way a man hears a flat tire start, and he said yes, and that he had not been afraid like that since the war. And she nodded and reached across the table and put her hand over his stiff knuckles and left it there. And that was all either of them said about it that night. Outside the window, the dark sat against the glass and gave nothing back, and the coffee went cold a second time, and the clock over the stove ticked them toward a dawn that neither of them believed would fix anything. First, light came gray, and slow up the hollow, and proved nothing at all. Dale went down with the tractor and a chain to bring the heifer up. And in the daylight, the lane was just a lane, the cane just cane, the fork running brown with the night's rain. The print at the edge of the flattened ground had taken rain and slumped at its edges, but it was still there, still longer than his boot, still wrong. And he photographed it with his phone, and hated how the phone made it look small and ordinary. A smear in mud, nothing a stranger would cross the room to see. He laid his folding rule beside it and shot it again. 11 inches heel to tip. He wrote the number on the back of a feed receipt with a carpenter pencil, because he did not trust himself to remember it without wanting to make it smaller. He chained the heifer and dragged her up to the flat by the barn, and looked at her in the daylight he had wanted all night. And the daylight did not help. The neck was as wrong as it had been in the dark. There was a single set of punctures behind the skull, 4 of them, spaced wider than any animal he could name, and around them the hide was unbroken. Otherwise no claw rake, no chew, nothing fed upon. Whatever had done it had done only that. The one motion, the wringing of the neck, and had left 600 pounds of beef to lie in the cane untouched. A coyote killed to eat, a dog killed for the joy of it, and tore as it went. This had killed the way a man kills a thing that is in his way, and then it had stood on the far bank and made a sound at him, and Dale stood by the barn with the rule still in his hand, and understood that the explanation he wanted did not exist. He called the county anyway because that was the order of things, and he was a man who kept the order of things. The dispatcher took it down. A deputy came out around 11, a young one named Pruitt, with a soft handshake and a notebook he barely used, and he looked at the heifer and said it was probably dogs, a pack of them. Feral dogs ran these hollows and brought down stock all the time. Dale asked him what dogs turned a neck without tearing the hide. Pruitt said, animals did strange things. Dale showed him the print and the 11-inch measurement, and Pruitt looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided not to see, and said the rain had probably spread it and that prints in mud were tricky, and that he would file the report and Dale should call animal control about the dogs. He left before noon. He did not take a photograph of the print. He did not measure it himself. The whole of it had taken under 20 minutes. Pruitt had stood by the dead heifer with his thumbs in his belt, and looked at the punctures behind the skull, 4 of them spaced wide as a man's spread hand, and Dale had watched the young man's face do the small work of refusing them. "There's been dogs all up and down this county this spring," Pruitt said. "Somebody's hound's gone wild, most likely. You want to keep that rifle handy and you'll get a shot at them sooner or later." Dale had said the hide wasn't torn. Pruitt said dogs did that sometimes. Killed and didn't feed. Killed for the fun of it. Dale said he had run dogs his whole life and never seen one part barbed wire with its hands and draw the staples and fold the strands back. And Pruitt had looked at him then, a flat, patient look, the look of a man deciding how much paperwork a crazy old farmer was going to cost him. He wrote 3 lines in the notebook. He did not ask to see the fence. When his cruiser had climbed the lane and turned out onto the county road and the sound of it had faded into the ordinary noise of a Tennessee afternoon, Dale stood in his own yard and understood that the report would go in a drawer in a building 40 minutes away, and that no one would ever read it, and that whatever came down the hollow next would come to a place the world had already stopped listening to. That was the first of it, and Dale would think later that the deputy leaving was the moment the hollow closed around them, the moment the door shut on the ordinary world and the lock turned, because after that there was no one to call who would come. And he and Renata were left alone at the bottom of the seam with whatever it was that had decided to come down off the ridge. The dog's theory lasted, Dale, until the second night, when it died for good. He had buried the heifer with the backhoe and burned the cane down to the dirt, because he did not want the smell drawing more of whatever scavenged, and he had spent the day mending the lower fence where he thought the heifer had pushed through, and in the mending he found the place. The fence had not been pushed. 3 strands of barbed wire had been parted, not broken, the staples drawn cleanly from the post and the wire bent back in a neat fan, exactly the way a man parts a fence with his hands when he means to step through and does not want to cut himself. He stood at the parted fence and looked at the drawn staples in his palm and felt the careful explanation slide off the situation entirely and leave it bare. Dogs did not draw staples. Dogs did not part wire and folded back. Something with hands had opened his fence, and it had opened it from the timber side, coming in, not from the pasture side, going out. He did not tell Renata about the staples that night. He told himself he did not want to frighten her, and that was half of it, and the other half was that saying it out loud would make it a fact in the house, and he wanted one more night where the house did not know. He set the staples on the window sill over the kitchen sink, where he would see them in the morning, and remember he had not imagined it. He checked the doors twice. He took the old lever action down from above the bedroom door and loaded it and leaned it in the corner. And Renata watched him do it and said nothing. And the saying, nothing, was its own kind of conversation. It came back at 2:40 the second night. Dale knew the time because he was awake, lying in the dark with his eyes open, listening to the hollow. And the hollow had gone silent again, the way it had gone silent in the lane, the peepers cutting off all at once, the creek running on alone, and he was up and at the window before the first sound came. When it came from the pasture, from the dark between the house and the barn, the bass rumble, under the chattering vibration, closer than it had been across the fork, close enough that he felt it move the small bones behind his ears. Renata sat up in bed. She did not turn on the light. She had learned that much already in one day. That light in the window was a thing you did not want to offer. He went room to room in the dark with the rifle. The way a man checks a house he has lived in for 30 years and can walk blind. He looked out every window. He saw nothing in the pasture, nothing by the barn. And then, low at the tree line, where the timber started, he saw the eyes. 2 of them, amber gold, catching the thin light off the clouded sky and throwing it back. And they were set wider than any animal's eyes should be. And they were high. That was the thing his mind kept stumbling on. They were higher off the ground than a dog's eyes, higher than a bear on all fours, set at the height a tall man's eyes would be if the tall man stood at the tree line and watched the house. And they were steady. They did not bob with breathing or shift with nervousness. They held on the house, on his window, the way a thing looks when it is not startled, but measuring. And Dale stood behind the glass, with the rifle in his hands, and understood that it knew which window he was at. He did not raise the rifle. Some cold and ancient calculation in him understood that a shot in the dark at a thing he could not fully see would do nothing but tell it that he was afraid, and he was not going to give it that. And there was also the simpler arithmetic that the eyes were 300 yards off across open ground. So he stood, and it stood, and the 2 of them held the dark between them, for what his watch later told him was 19 minutes. And then the eyes were gone, not blinking out one at a time the way an animal turns its head, but both at once dropped or turned away in a single motion. And the silence held another half hour before the peepers found their voices again and told him the thing had left the hollow. In the morning he walked the tree line and found where it had stood. The ground there was firm and took little, but it took enough. The same long print, the same 5 points, the same 5th toe set off and low, and this time there were 2 of them, side by side, a stride apart. The way a thing stands when it stands on 2 legs and waits. He measured the distance between the prints and the width of the stance, and he wrote it all on the feed receipt under the 11 inches. And the receipt was becoming a document, a flat catalog of things he could measure about a thing he could not name, and the measuring was the only ground he had left to stand on. He photographed the 2 prints with his rule between them. He bagged a clump of coarse hair the wire had taken at the parted fence, dark and longer than his hand, and he sealed it in a sandwich bag and wrote the date on it. And he did not know what he would ever do with it, and he kept it anyway. Because a man who trusts evidence keeps the evidence even when there is no court that will hear it. He stood at the two prints a long time after he had measured them. They faced the house. That was the thing he kept coming back to as he crouched over them, with the sun coming weak through the cloud. A deer track told you where the deer was going. A coyote track told you the coyote was passing through, on its way to somewhere a coyote needed to be. These two prints were not passing through. They were planted, toes toward the house. The weight settled back into the heels, the way a man's weight settles when he has stood in one place a long while and means to stand longer. And the ground between them and the house was open pasture, 300 yards of it. And Dale stood up and looked across that open ground at his own kitchen window and saw it the way the thing had seen it. A lit square in the dark a quarter-mile off, a small, bright box with people in it. And he made himself stop looking because the seeing was a door and he did not want to learn to think the way the thing thought. He folded the rule. He put the bagged hair in his shirt pocket over his heart where he would feel it against him all day. He walked back across the pasture toward the house and did not once let himself look back at the tree line, and the not looking cost him something, and he paid it. The third day, Renata's sister Carla called from over in the next county, the way she called most Sundays. And Renata told her some of it. The heifer and the dogs the deputy had blamed, and Carla went quiet on the line and then said a thing that put a new cold into the house. She said old Webb Tatum, who had farmed the head of the hollow before he died and whose place was grown up in cedar, now used to tell about losing stock up there back in the 70s, calves taken in a way that never got explained, and prints he swore to that the game warden laughed at. And how Webb had moved his family down to the flatland near the river the year before he sold out, and never would say plainly why Renata had grown up hearing Webb Tatum was strange. She had not heard this. She told Dale, and Dale listened, and he did not take comfort from it, and did not take fear from it, only a kind of grim confirmation, the sense of a thing that had been here before, and had a memory of the place, and had come back to a hollow it knew. He remembered Webb Tatum a little. An old man already when Dale was a boy, a man who would not keep a dog and would not stay out past dark, and who had built his fences higher than fences needed to be. People had laughed about that. Dale's own father had called Webb a nervous old fool who let his land go to seed because he was scared of his own woods, and Dale had taken that judgment the way a boy takes his father's judgments, whole and unexamined, and carried it 40 years. Now he stood in the kitchen, with the phone still warm in Renata's hand, and reconsidered every story he had ever heard about the man at the head of the hollow. Webb had built his fences high. Webb had moved his children to the river. Webb had let 40 good acres go back to cedar rather than work them after dark, and the county had called him strange for it. And Dale understood now that strange was the word people used for a man who had seen a thing they had not seen. He did not feel less alone for the knowing. He felt the opposite. He felt himself standing at the bottom of a long line of men who had stood in this hollow and met this same dark and had no one believe them. And he understood that the line did not end with Webb Tatum and that he was its newest length. That was when he started to understand it was not random. And the understanding was worse than the fear. The thing had a pattern. It had come to the lane, and then to the fence, and then to the tree line at the house. And each time it had come closer, and each time it had stayed longer, and it had killed once, and then watched twice, and a thing that watches is a thing that is learning. He had read enough sign in his life to know what he was looking at. He was looking at an animal mapping a place and the people in it. He had done the same thing himself 100 times, sitting a deer stand, learning where the does crossed and when, learning the pattern so he could be in the right place when the pattern brought them to him. He knew what it felt like to be the one learning. He had never once thought about what it felt like to be the thing the pattern was being learned about. The fourth night he did not sleep at all, and neither did Renata. And they sat in the dark kitchen with the coffee and the rifle and the staples on the windowsill. And they talked, low, the way people talk when they are deciding something they do not want to name. The boys were grown and gone, one in Knoxville and one in the service, and there was a part of Dale that said, call them, and a larger part that said no. Because what would he say, and what would they do but drive into the dark hollow, and stand in it with him, and he was not going to pull his sons down into this. There was the simpler answer, which was to leave, to get in the truck and drive out, and not come back until daylight and figure the rest out from town. And Renata said it plainly, said maybe they should just go, and Dale sat with it. He did not say no out of pride. He was not a man who confused stubbornness for courage. He sat with the question square